Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. Just imagine that we're all seated behind this lovely crackling fire, and it doesn't matter where in the world we are, we all come together to listen to a fabulous story. And in my book, there's not a television show out there that beats a great story. And tonight's story is no exception to that golden rule. But before we get started, don't forget to get that quintessential drink because you're going to need it, because tonight's story is going to pull at your heartstrings. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my mother was behaving strangely. I certainly perceived this, as I knew her better than anybody else in the entire world, with of course the exception of my father. When someone you love is acting in a peculiarly odd way, it seizes and demands your attention, like the blazing bright red graffiti on a wall. I was her only daughter among a family of 4 male siblings. If that wasn't ironic enough, it would seem that every pet we ever owned was also invariably male. How that happened I could never fully fathom. So it was with many interests in common, me and my mother gravitated towards each other, more as friends than mother and daughter. It was the summer of 1966, the illustrious Chinese year of the fire horse, a year so indelibly seared in my mind, it'll never ever be forgotten. I was about 19 years old at the time. It was raining cats and dogs outside for days on end. It seemed that there was no end in sight to the tireless, incessant, unrelenting showers that spilled tons of water over Washington state. Rather like a truck driver delivering a ton of compost. It was not that different. The earth is crying, my mother would say, when the clouds burst open to unleash their heavy volume on the earth. But then again, she sighed, there's a lot for her to be crying about, is there not? I let the comment slip away, rather like a buzzing insect on a window pane, but I did not know what on earth she meant by such an off-the-cuff remark, which I wilfully chose to ignore. We watched the water splashing on the glass panes of the outside window, as long trails of opaque tears drizzled down the glass. Our home at the time was not far from Spokane in Washington, a simple rustic affair, or symmetrical home if you like, that had been built by my father's father. It was lovingly built from timber beams, resembling your quintessential wooden cabin, lacking the lavish stylized interventions of the more grandiose homes of the day. Yet it was simple, homespun if you like, but it was cosy, warm, like a nest, the one place in the world we felt the most comfortable, relaxed and at ease. Yet despite everything, my mother had masterfully succeeded with a magical touch of savoir-faire into transforming the interior of our home into an inviting, welcoming, congenial space, or tranquil oasis if you like, by using a mishmash of unique furnishings that she picked up for next to nothing from second-hand thrift stores. Surprisingly enough, they rarely worked, adding a touch of quirky charm, reflecting our understanding of the modern-day shabby chic look, which epitomized the look of our home at the time unimpeachably. If there were any positives to this deluge of rain that had hit Washington, by all accounts there were some remarkable benefits that were plain to see. The air was so fresh, crisp, pleasingly fragrant, with the after-rain smell of petrichor. Everywhere you looked, the world had become a vibrant, viridescent green. The tall, statuesque ponderosa pines that fringed our home on every single side literally glistened from the raindrops that clung to their needles like opaque jewels. This profound afterglow from the rain always felt as if the earth had been dusted by a team of highly skilled cleaners who removed the cobwebs, the bird droppings, the dusty veils of dirt that clung to the plants and trees, while any sluggish plants subdued by the long drawn-out warm summer days had promptly discarded their former unwanted wilted leaves, embracing a much more vibrant wardrobe that subsequently gleamed, blossomed, and burst into colourful blooms. Everything looked fresh, as if the dust on the landscape had been washed away, leaving the earth renewed, restored, revitalized, lush, vibrant, spectacularly beautiful. Here in Washington, the weather could be so variable that you could experience 4 seasons in a single day. But the rain that we'd been experiencing of late had no desire of taking a back seat, but was determined to be central stage for a while, that is. My mother was clenching her fists together so tightly, opening and closing them repetitively, while she paced around the cabin up and down like a cooped-up tiger in a zoo enclosure. If you had been a fly on the wall, you would have assumed the woman was feeling confined or trapped like a bird in a cage who was longingly waiting for the weather to shift. Yet I knew my mother's behaviour better than most. It was not related to the weather at all. Something else was ailing her, and whatever it was clearly a great source of displeasure for her. The fact that she was shutting me out of her little secret was more than a little unsettling for me, but I chose to say nothing about the matter. I was biting my lips in order to subdue my tongue, for it was all I could do to ask her what the heck was wrong, and why she was acting so weird. One thing about my mother was she had nerves of steel and guts on her that would have made those merciless pirates on the high seas more than a little impressed by her feisty, determined fighting spirit. For indeed my mother was one of a kind. I think years of growing up in London during the Second World War had left an indelible mark on her life that was impossible to erase, making her a tough nut to crack. For she had lived under the assault of nightly bombing raids, spending much time hiding out in air raid shelters. It had been a time of chaos, disarray, devastation, where food and clothes shortages or rationing were commonplace as the sparrows in your front yard, that is. I remember she told me she would lie in bed at night, clenching her fists so tightly, much like she was doing right now. She would hear the rumbles and explosions of bombs going off throughout the night from a long distance away. She would wonder who had been hit. She would beg, "Please, God, make it stop." But it seemed that God was not hearing the prayers of this desperate young girl. If the bombing were too close to home, she said you could feel the earth shift the ground beneath you, heaving, groaning, wobbling, shaking, like a massive explosion on a demolition site, where you could hear whole buildings crashing to the ground like piles of Lego blocks. Ostensibly, more often or not, if the noise loomed closer, her family would rush to the air raid shelter at the bottom of the yard. It was what you had to do back in those days, she had explained to me. We were like terrified mice, continuously fleeing from the household tabby every time it ventured too close to the mousehole. It felt like that for us, she told me. So this intrinsic fight and flight adrenaline response was indeed an inbuilt part of our lives. We were always running, hiding, as if our lives depended on it. You could wake up in a single morning to find your geographic location completely distorted, for with the bombings assaulting the city on a regular basis, what it looked like today could indeed be a very different picture the following morning, so one never knew exactly what to expect. One night the neighbour's little girl had come running over to my mother's parents' house, unbeknown to her own parents. She crept out of the house surreptitiously, with the determination of a gutsy young girl. She was crying inconsolably, as her treasured little kitten was caught up in a tree in the backyard. It appeared too afraid to come down, for it had climbed up the tree far too far and lost its nerve. She begged her parents to help her get the kitten down from its high perch in the tree. They had assured her that the kitten would do just fine on its own and would still be there in the morning, and then they would get it down for her. In the meantime, she needed to go to bed right now and get some well-needed sleep. The little girl knew from experience that it would not necessarily be fine. It seldom ever was. She knew her precious little kitten might not be there in the morning, as the bombings had made you all too well aware of the fragility of life. The little girl had been banging on the front door. My mother's father, in his blue and white striped pyjamas, darted down the sweeping staircase to see what on earth was going on. Who was rapping on the door at this ungodly hour of the night? It would appear that the little 7-year-old girl, clutching a teddy bear tightly to her chest, stood outside their door, trembling, wobbling like a jelly, her white face so desperately pale, her hazel eyes flooding with tears. She looked so lost, fragile, so vulnerable, like a helpless drowned kitten on the side of the road that desperately needed rescuing. "What's wrong, little tinker?" my mother's father asked the girl, a look of horror enveloping his face as he began to mull over in his mind what the problem could be. You see, in wartime you could easily envisage the worst-case scenario in any given moment. The girl began to blubber. Her childlike words were incomprehensible, drowned out by her tears. My kitten, my kitten, my The girl beckoned for my grandfather to follow her. By this time, my grandmother and my mother, who was 15 at the time, joined my father at the front door. They unhesitantly followed the young girl to her backyard, with the full light of their kerosene lamps, their hearts heavy, as they feared that something quite terrible had happened to Tinker's parents. In a trice, the low drones and booming sounds could be heard over the city, along with the sounds of the shrill, ear-blasting air raid sirens going off spontaneously. Then there was such a loud, ear-piercing, shattering explosion that ripped, stabbed through the fabric of the earth with such a violent, forceful, tearing power that my mother's family, along with the little girl, went spontaneously flying across the grass in her yard like the pellets in a BB gun. My mother's parents trembled, shook, jiggled in shock, hardly daring to believe that the house that they'd been sleeping in only moments before was now lying in a heap of rubble on the ground. If they hadn't been evacuated from the house so swiftly by the distressed young girl, their lifeless, unresponsive bodies would now be buried under the house right now. My mother told me that for a very long time afterwards, no one said a single word, for such was the level of shock. Granted, you could hear the background sounds of the air raid sirens blasting through the night sky, the rumbling aftershocks of loose debris, as stones, brick, cement, scaffolding, and loose building material went rolling precariously along the ground, until it too finally stopped. Professedly the voices of screaming people, their piercing, anxious cries, dreadful screams, sent chills of dread throbbing down your spine, interrupted the night with an inauspicious heaviness. But in this moment of time, all was still, so still, in fact, that you could have cut the silence with a knife. My mother's father, or grandfather if you like, was the first to speak.
"How did that even happen? There wasn't any warning. No siren going off in time to warn us. We could have been in there. We could be dead by now."
In that second, my mother and her parents cradled each other in their arms, ever grateful for having their lives so graciously spared, not wanting to let go of each other. The young girl, who'd fallen on the ground from the huge quaking effects of the gigantic explosion, rose from her fallen position, stumbling awkwardly to her feet, unperturbed by the rude, fortuitous intrusion of an impetuous bomb. Her thoughts, so unselfish, centered on her beloved friend. She gestured towards a tall tree in her yard. My parents diligently followed her lead. The young girl pointed up towards the tree. "Please help him," she cried earnestly. "Please, please help him." My grandparents glanced up at the tree, and there on the branch was the most petrified kitten that they'd ever seen. It was trembling so much, its green eyes round with terror, its grey silken hair puffed up to twice its size. My grandfather unhesitantly climbed up the tree to retrieve the poor kitten for the young girl. She grabbed it in her tiny hands, rubbing her soft cheeks into its soft-textured fur. Then she began to sob. "Thank you, mister. Thank you so much for what you've just done for me."
"Thank you," said my grandfather. "Thank you, little Tinker. You did a fine job tonight, a splendid job. You didn't just rescue your little kitten there, you rescued us all as well."
My mother's parents looked at each other in shock, as it hit them that this kitten had saved their lives, along with the desperate concern of a little girl for its welfare. At that they burst out laughing, for in wartime even the most inappropriate things had their humour. The girl's parents were frantically looking for little Tinker, crying out her name in desperation, obliviously unaware of their daughter's heroism. Those stories, and many like them, were commonplace during the Second World War, where strange and ominous events might surreptitiously lead people away from a building moments before a bomb was to hit their home. It was experiences like this for my mother, including the days of living on bread and milk, or hours spent restlessly queuing outside the butcher's in the vain hope that there might just be a piece of beef for dinner that night. All these tumultuous challenges had chiselled, shaped, moulded my mother, like a great work of modern sculpture, into a woman of steely strength and grit, the woman that she had become. For believe me, she could be as tough as old boots, should the need ever arise. My mother possessed a lean, trim figure, a long, buoyant head of curly, dark curls, and was so easy on the eye. She was terribly pretty. She had married my father after a chance meeting in King's Cross when a gust of wind had blown my mother's hat down the street, whereby my gallant father had eagerly run after it to retrieve it for her. My mother had been mesmerised by the allure of this handsome American stranger, with his irresistible charming southern drawl. She was not about to let him go in a hurry, nor slip through her fingers like melted butter, so the retrieval of a hat was the perfect excuse to get better acquainted with him. The rest is history, after which my parents married and moved to Washington. So now you perhaps understand, with my mother's background history, that this courageous woman was not easily upset about anything, as growing up in the war had given her a tough inner hide. It would appear that on this occasion something was clearly troubling her, as her eyes kept darting towards our gravel driveway, as if expecting a strange visitor. My father and 4 brothers had gone fishing at the lake, so we were all alone, and as far as I knew it, we weren't expecting anyone. All of a sudden we could hear heavy rubber wheels grinding wet gravel as the rain continued to fall. A white truck rolled up our driveway until it screeched to a final stop, while the engine switched off. The sound of the truck door being opened and slammed could be heard, along with the crunch of heavy feet as they finally approached our front door. "Thank goodness he's here," sighed my mother with relief, rushing over to the door to welcome in the tall stranger. The man almost shook himself like a wet dog as my mother helped him remove his raincoat, guiding him into our warm kitchen, where she busied herself preparing the stranger tea. My mother's idea that tea was a solution to every problem was of course deeply entrenched in her English roots. "I'm so glad you came," she said, clanging the cutlery together and promptly placing a warm cup of tea in front of the man, who took it gratefully, glugging down a couple of big gulps. I would say he was in his 40s, with a receding hairline with dark brown eyes that rather reminded me of a raven, very perceptive, quick and discerning, which I was to learn later complemented his line of profession. "This is my daughter Hazel, Mr. Potter. What you tell me, you can tell her as well." "Are you sure that's wise, Mrs. Levy? Will not the delicate nature of our discussion cause her undue stress?" "Good gracious, no, Mr. Potter. I'd like to think of my daughter being made of sterner stuff than that. Otherwise she'll be about as much use as a broken folding chair on a camping trip." "What's going on, Mum? Who are you, Mr. Potter, if you don't mind me asking?" "Mr. Potter is a private investigator," said my mother. "He's been investigating your father's coming and goings of late on my behalf." "You're spying on Dad?" I asked, looking at my mother with an aghast expression on my face. "How could you do that to him, Mum? That's disgusting. You wouldn't like it if Dad kept spying on you." "Get a grip, Hazel," piped my mother. "I hired Mr. Potter here to find out if your father has been having an affair." "Mother, that's insanely ridiculous. Dad loves the bones of you. He'd never ever cheat on you in 100 years. "That's not what one of the ladies in the book club seems to think. She swore blind she saw your father hand in hand with a blonde leaving the Jefferson Hotel in Washington together." I gasped. There must be some mistake. Dad would never do that to you. Mr. Potter cleared his throat uncomfortably, pulling out a brown envelope from the bag that he'd been carrying. "I think you need to see these," he said, "to give you the answers you're looking for." My mother grabbed the photographs unhesitantly, staring at them for a moment as she rifled through one photograph after another, as if reviewing a collection of still clips from a holiday abroad. "I knew it! I knew it! Your father's cheating on me, with the likes of Tasha Simpson. Oh, it doesn't get more obscene than that. If that isn't offensive enough, he's cheating on me. But I would credit him as having a little bit more taste than Tasha Simpson. I mean, that girl is the town floozy. You couldn't get lower than that if you tried. You couldn't even sink lower." "You know this young lady?" asked the private investigator, lifting his brow in an expression of surprise. "Know her? Of course I know her, Mr. Potter. There isn't a man in Washington state that doesn't. Nor is there a man that is safe with that woman around. She's wrecked more marriages than you and I have had hot dinners. She had an affair with Pastor Doug Fielding last year. The poor, poor man, he's now living in a trailer park somewhere, his life hanging in limbo, in tatters around him. Even his devout flock have abandoned him, rather like a noxious bad smell. It's a terribly sad story." "Not a good woman, then,"
said the investigator, stroking his moustache reflectively. Even I could see that from miles away. But men can be so easily fooled and seduced by a charming, beguiling smile and a naive, innocent look. She has the whole act down to a masterful fine art. Looks like a predator to me, lurking in the shadows, eager to take down her unsuspecting quarry. A huntress of men, shall we say, and a very good one at that, too. It would seem her victims ever fail to see from beyond the sweet, curvaceous veneer. For beneath what lies a narcissistic snake. I'm very fortunate that my insight through years of sleuthing has made me a remarkably good judge of character. Well, it sounds like you are correct about that. You're describing her superbly, Mr. Potter. I couldn't have put it better myself. I grabbed the photograph from my mother's hands, my heart plunging like a rock, sinking to the depths of a very large lake. This was my father, the man I respected, revered, esteemed, in such high regard, the man in my own eyes who could do no wrong. But in a matter of seconds, my opinion of him was washed away like the water being drained from a sink. I studied the pictures over and over again. The compromising positions, the long kisses, the pathetic, adoring puppy dog looks. It made my skin want to crawl. Waves of nausea rose up in the back of my throat in disgusted revulsion. I wanted to get into the photograph myself, to shake my father so hard, to tell him to wake up, to smell the coffee. What the heck was wrong with him? There was no doubt in my mind that my father had completely lost leave of his senses, along with my respect. I felt as if I'd been hit in the head by a forklift truck. I can't believe it. I can't believe it, I said, sounding as if I'd run the Boston Marathon. I was so out of breath. How could he do this to you, Mum? If Nathan, Robert, Carl, Leith knew about this, they would kill him. Leave your brothers out of this, Hazel dear. There's no need to overreact. If you must know, I blame the little treacherous snake for all our current troubles. That woman delights in her hot pursuit of married men. She has it down to a fine art, she does. It's like she's hooked on ruining people's marriages. Gets a rush over it, like some people get a high on drugs. I must admit, I never put your father down as a man of such weak resolve, who would fall for her bait like an unsuspecting fish to a fisherman's line. But then again, maybe I underestimate Tasha Simpson's poignant powers of persuasion. The private investigator cleared his throat. I trust I've given you the information you need, Miss Levy. I'm sorry that my investigations had to uncover such disagreeable, unpleasant truths, but as I've always said to my clients, it is best to know what's going on behind your back than to be left cluelessly in the dark. Now, is there anything else you might need? There is, as it happens. Do you happen to know if Tasha has any fixed daily routines by any chance? Well, she has coffee at 9 at the Sizzling Grill every morning, if that helps. Oh, and she takes her Yorkshire Terrier on the Blue Ridge Trail every afternoon. At about 5, I think. Why are you asking, Miss Levy? He paused for a moment and said, I know you're angry, Miss Levy, and rightly so. I would be in your shoes as well. And I know it's none of my business, so please forgive me for butting in. But I would advise you to be very careful, if I were you. That Tasha Simpson, she's not a good woman. She can't be trusted. You must be very careful. I was amazed to see how stoic my mother was after the investigator's blinding revelations, which would have made most women crumble, fall apart, rush to the divorce courts as fast as they possibly could. But not my mother. Instead, my mother was composed, reflective, thoughtful, mellow even, as if nothing fazed her in the slightest. Are you going to divorce Dad? I asked my mother. I would if I were wearing your shoes. I'd never let a man treat me like that. What Dad has done to you is despicable. I can't get my head around it. I'm in shock. I feel as if the rug has been pulled from beneath our feet. You think I'm going to divorce your father over this slight mishap? Said my mother, looking at me appalled. I have had to fight for everything in my life, Hazel. The war didn't make it easy for any of us. I'm not about to throw away the best thing that has ever happened to me in my life just because of your father's quick tumble in the hay with Tasha Simpson. I'd like to think I'm made of sterner stuff than that. Mum, it's more than a tumble in the hay. Did you not see the pictures? Did you not see the way they were looking at each other in the photographs?
I did see those pictures, Hazel. But I saw a different picture altogether. I saw a man completely seduced by a woman who has lured him in her duplicitous net like a lamb to the slaughter. Your father, Hazel. He's obliviously unaware of how hoodwinked he is. Tasha is like a female praying mantis eating her man alive, while he's none the wiser as to what is going on. Until it's all too late, of course. You're saying Dad's weak? That's a first. Well, that may be a fitting description as far as Tasha Simpson is concerned. But I want you to promise me one thing, Hazel dear, that you're not going to breathe a word about this to your father, nor to your brothers. They don't need to know about any of this. Promise? But why? I protested. Don't you think you should confront Dad with what he's done? Sometimes, Hazel dear, it's best to let sleeping dogs lie. Not to ruffle any feathers. But as far as Tasha Simpson is concerned, the boa constrictor, shall we say, I'm on to her. I'm going to get her off your father so he can finally breathe again. And I'm going to also take those rose-coloured blinders off his eyes. My mother's plan rolled into action on a Tuesday afternoon. The rain in Washington had finally subsided, but the fruits of the generous deluge were clear to see, for everything in Washington was thriving, blossoming, propagating, while the world was swathed in carpets of rich green, wherever you looked. We were in the truck waiting for Tasha to arrive at the Blue Ridge Trail to walk her Yorkshire Terrier, while our French bulldog Dozer seemed to think all his Christmases had come at once. For visiting a new walking destination for him was not without its appeal. He was bounding up and down the seats, looking out of every window, wagging his tail profusely, making slow woofing sounds at the back of his throat to express his rapturous enthusiasm. We could see the occasional dog walker returning to the truck after their walk, then driving away, while we remained still in our truck, waiting, hoping that Tasha would finally show up. When she did, all the other dog walkers had long since left and gone home. We were the only truck remaining in the parking bay. On hearing Tasha's truck gliding into the lot, we automatically ducked for cover under the seats so as not to be seen or observed by her. We could hear the young woman open the side door of her car, slamming it behind her as she trailed into the woods, a secluded, resplendent sanctuary composed of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, along with open hiking trails, verdant ground covers from ferns, mosses, fungi, pretty flowering shrubs. I could only see the silhouette of the woman's straight back. She was wearing bright pink leggings, pink leg warmers and a fluffy pink top, while her blonde curly hair sported a pink headband. Even her adorable little dog was wearing a bright pink collar, running happily beside her, sniffing the ground intently, as if picking up a kaleidoscope of exciting scents. "There's our little boa constrictor," said my mother. "We'll keep a distance behind her in the woods. Then I'm going to pounce on her in surprise, deliver a few home truths that she needs to hear. I want to ensure she leaves this place with her tail between her legs, and, of course, my husband alone." "Are you sure you know what you're doing, Mum?" I asked, as we both followed the unsuspecting young woman into the woods. Finally, we caught up with her. She turned around, looking directly at my mother with eyes blazing like daggers. Make no mistake about it, she knew exactly who my mother was, and did not even dignify her with a slight blush in regards to her guileful indiscretions. Instead, she looked as innocent as a china doll, as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. "What are you doing, creeping on me like that?" she snapped, looking at us belligerently. "How dare you pounce on me and my dog with such stealth? I thought you were a mountain lion." "Oh, believe me, Tasha Simpson, I wish I was a mountain lion, because I would tear you apart, limb from limb. Where do you get off trying to steal other people's husbands?" "Steal," giggled Tasha. "So you know about my affair with your pathetic husband, do you?" she said, her eyes twinkling as though revelling in my mother's indignation. "So you think I had to steal your husband from you, is that it? Believe me, girl, there was no stealing involved. Your husband was practically begging for my affections. It would seem he can't get enough of me. But then who could blame him? I mean, look at me. Look at you. It's like comparing creme caramel with a stodgy rice pudding. No contest at all. Can't get enough of a cheap tart like you? What are you smoking, girl? Look at yourself. You're a cheap floozy. Anyone can see that at a glance. You look cheap, you speak cheap, you act cheap. Look at the tsunami of broken marriages trailing behind you.
The lives you've so callously ruined, the hearts you've so willfully broken. Why, I don't believe there's a shred of human decency in your boa constrictor soul. You love squeezing the life out of everyone you meet, and enjoying it in the process. You're seriously sick. You're unhinged, woman. Tasha made a hissing sound like a snake. Tsa, tsa, tsa. So I'm sucking the life out of your husband, am I? I confess I'm enjoying every minute of it too. Once I've drained him completely dry, I'll hand you over the leftover carcass, shall I? You're a snake, said my mother, lunging towards the woman, grabbing a piece of her blonde hair which she tugged very hard. The woman screamed, "Ah!" Her face growing crimson with rage, her body rattling like a snake in her indignation. Her eyes seemed to hiss with fury. Before I knew it, both women were kicking, screaming, hitting, fighting each other, creating such a commotion that the forest floor began to visibly shake. There were legs flying in the air like loose cricket bats, arms oscillating wildly like octopus tentacles, and angry shrieks and screams piercing the ear like firecrackers taking off in the sky all at once. "Ma'am," I cried, "stop this, please, stop, before someone gets seriously hurt." But it seemed that my words had fallen on deaf ears as the screams, protests and wails persisted. Tasha's Yorkshire Terrier and our French Bulldog were trailing around the undergrowth very happily, lifting legs, sniffing leaves, obliviously unaware of the upheaval in their midst, or if they even had an inkling about it, they sensibly turned a blind eye. I could hear a thundering sound moving through the woods, getting ever closer. If you hadn't known any better, you might have suspected it was the rumble of an underground earthquake somewhere. But this booming momentum was deliberate as it ventured and moved ever closer. Then standing yards away from the two fighting women was a female Bigfoot. At the time I didn't know what she was, but I knew she was the most intimidating, intriguing creature that I'd ever beheld in my entire life. I was gobsmacked. I think the thing that struck me the most was how remarkably human she appeared to be, with of course the exception of her overlong arms, distinctive pyramid-shaped head, and of course the fact that she was easily over 700 pounds, so very substantial in weight. She was covered in long flowing hazelnut hair, with a distinctive auburn hue. Her full breasts were low slung on a remarkably muscular chest, where the ropey ripples of muscular definition came busting through the skin, like the gnarled, knotty roots of a tree rising above the earthen floor. I noticed in the depths of her deep-set, treacle-coloured eyes there appeared to be a befuddled expression on her face as she witnessed this bizarre, incongruous scene unfolding before her, as the two angry women wrestled each other in a heated rage. She scratched her head as if grappling with how to respond to this outlandish situation, or whether to respond to it at all. She seemed hesitant, reluctant, uncertain, but her jawline twitched nervously. Then, as if she had had just about as much as she could take, she screamed, her jaw opening wide to unleash a bellowing cry. In that second the incessant fighting stopped, as the two startled women looked up to see this monstrous creature screaming at the top of her lungs, while the reverberating sounds of the high-pitched screams caused the forest to violently shake. My mother and Tasha ran through the forest as fast as they possibly could, hardly daring to draw breath, while my mother was shouting for me and Dozer. "Hazel! Dozer! Get back to the truck now! Hazel! Dozer!" I stood there still, frozen like a statue, but not with fear, with total, wondrous awe. The creature's eyes locked into mine. I could see a glint of amusement in their depths, as if she too was surprised by the efficiency of her own scream, for it had certainly broken up the fight. We shared a meaningful moment together, at the understanding of what had just transpired. This extraordinary, intelligent female Bigfoot had scared two women witless out of their fight. I knew that she had been the peacemaker, although on the surface she appeared anything but I knew differently. "Clever girl," I whispered to myself, "clever girl." The creature's eyes smiled at me, as if she knew exactly what I was saying. I watched in wondrous awe and admiration, as on two powerful legs she glided away so gracefully, seemingly pleased that the peace had once again been restored to the forest. I searched for the two dogs. I found them cowering in terror under a briar bush. They had sensed the presence of this powerful beast, and were less than amused. I managed to persuade them to come out of their hiding place. I imagine the Bigfoot's terrifying screams had clearly unsettled them.
I walked out of the forest with the 2 dogs beside me. Tasha's truck had already left the area. I can't say I was surprised. She had even abandoned her own dog in her haste to leave. As was expected, my brave mother was seated in her truck, contemplating what to do next, as she knew I was in the forest with that thing around, along with 2 very frightened dogs. My mother looked startled to see me approach her truck so casually, without any haste, accompanied by an air of indifference, as if this had been no different to any other walk in the park.
"Thank God you're all right! Did you see it? Did you see it?"
I nodded. I saw it.
"Did you hear it?"
I nodded.
"What the heck? What was it?"
"I'd be damned if I know," I said. It seemed very human.
"Is that all you can say, Hazel? What the heck is wrong with you, dear? There was a monster in the woods, and you're behaving as if you saw the neighbour's tabby. How can you sit there looking so unfazed? That thing, it was a monster if I ever saw one, and a scary one at that. I've been sitting here doing my nut, wondering what I should do, because you could have been killed by that thing.
I was hoping you'd be savvy enough to sneak back to the truck with Dozer and Tasha's Yorkie. But the way you're acting, Hazel, it's very unsettling for me. You're acting like it was no big deal, like it was nothing. That creature could have killed us. Did you see the size of the thing? It wouldn't have killed us, Mother. Not any of us. The creature screamed to break your fight. It was seriously getting out of hand with the 2 of you, fighting like wild dogs. I imagine half your hair is scattered across the forest floor by now. I think it was more concerned that you and Tasha might actually harm each other. I think she was actually looking out for the both of you."
"Are you crazy, Hazel?" piped my mother. "Did you not see how it screamed at us? That was not a creature looking after our best interests. It was a creature that wanted to tear us apart, limb from limb."
"I think you'll find, Mother, that you and Tasha were doing a pretty good job at that." When I returned home to the cabin with Tasha's dog in tow, I phoned her up. "Hello," came a quiet, subdued voice at the other end of the telephone. "Hi, Tasha. I've got your dog from the woods."
"You've got Felix!" she cried out in delight. "You've got my baby! Is he all right?"
"He's absolutely fine. I've got your Felix."
The creature, it didn't kill him?"
"No, Felix is absolutely fine. But you're not going to be getting him back any time soon, until you tell my father that you don't want to ever see him again. You need to end that relationship now, this very second, or you'll never see Felix again, because I will be keeping him." "Oh, I'll do that," she said with an air of indifference. "I'll break up with him now. But I want my dog pronto, understand?" It confirmed my worst fears. Tasha had never cared a bean for my father. That all happened a long time ago. Since then, my mother and father have long since been deceased, while I myself am now embracing the winter years of my life. For the one thing I've learnt, life is very short, far too short. My mother was a brave wartime girl who hung on to the things she loved with a steely grit and determination, refusing to let go of what mattered to her in life, and fighting for it if needs must. She graciously spared my father the huge indignity and humiliation of confronting him about his affair. But I'm in no doubt that despite his foolish indiscretions, my mother was quite literally the love of his life. As for Bigfoot, she used her savvy emotional intelligence to scare 2 women away from their fight. And for her emotional intelligence, I do admire her greatly. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, that is the most incredible story. All about the war and what it did to a woman, making her so strong in every department of her life. What an extraordinary story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.